World of Warcraft is a game built around the Holy Trinity. This means that tanks take damage, healers heal that damage, and DPS do damage to stuff. This fundamental design has existed since the game launched back in 2004 with the original 9 classes. Over the years we've seen an expansion of new classes too, which can also fulfill these roles, such as Death Knights, Monks, Demon Hunters, and most recently Evokers. So whilst the Holy Trinity's been added to, it's always been the cornerstone of World of Warcraft's combat. And within this Holy Trinity, different classes are bringing different strengths, and a balanced raid composition of a bunch of different classes should give you the best results. Classes are designed to rely on one another through buffs, debuffs, and unique utility. But here's the thing, that is not always the case in this game. Sometimes one class or spec is just way better than others. Maybe Blizzard overtuned something in a patch and took a while to nerf it, or maybe a boss mechanic synergizes perfectly with a singular class's toolkit. Or it could be any of the above to create a perfect storm of just one class or spec being crazy overpowered, and as a result stacked instead of us seeing a ton of class diversity. And that's what we'll be talking about today, 10 times when class stacking completely broke World of Warcraft raid bosses across any version of the game, all the way from vanilla to modern World of Warcraft. These will be 10 moments when the best thing to do was to bring as many of one class or spec as possible. So with that said, let's make a start. We'll begin in the Burning Crusade. It's an expansion that we're going to be revisiting pretty quickly, and it's no secret, whether it was back in the day or during Classic, that Shamans were one of the singular most desired classes in the game. Now Shamans have always been valuable because of their totems and utility, but in TBC they reached a whole new level of importance thanks to one brand new ability, Bloodlust, or Heroism if you were Alliance. Bloodlust back then increased haste by 30% for everyone in your group for 40 seconds and had a 10-minute cooldown. But here was the key detail where things were different in the future. There was no exhaustion debuff in Burning Crusade like there was in Wrath of the Lich King and beyond. This meant if you had a bunch of Shamans, you could rotate them into the same group and maintain that Bloodlust buff for your top DPS for the entire fight. Guilds would have several Shamans in their raid positioned in different groups for their totems, and when it was time to Bloodlust your group, they'd move the Shaman into the group with the top DPS, usually Destruction Warlocks, maybe BM Hunters, even Warriors later on into the expansion. The Shaman would cast Bloodlust and then be moved back into their original groups because that original group would still want their totems. And before that Bloodlust would wear off, you'd swap another one in and just keep rotating them. Even your average raid in TBC would want 5 Shamans, and raids were 25 players large at that point in time. But to really ensure full uptime on Bloodlust, you could easily go to 7 or to 8 Shamans in any single raid. And of course, top guilds looking to speedrun or pass would absolutely use this to their advantage. But TBC must have been the expansion where Shamans were the most stacked in World of Warcraft's history, with every single raid wanting at least 5 and you being able to go up to 7 to 8 quite comfortably. Before we go on, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is a platform that aims to equip you with the skills to forge a career in back-end development through interactive lessons and learning. It keeps this learning experience more interactive and goal-driven by bringing in features from RPGs, such as experience, achievements, and even leaderboards to keep you motivated to progress onwards. Boot.dev offers the tools to get fully on board with the Python and Go programming languages. It does this through tons of hands-on learning, where you're going to be writing loads of your own code so that you can get a grasp of the fundamentals from the basics onto more advanced lessons. On top of that, all the content is free to view and watch in guest mode, and there's even a 30-day no questions asked refund policy. So even if you're just interested in checking out how Boot works before you want to commit, there is very much the option to do that. So why not check them out? You can click the link in the description box and use my code Willie to get 25% off your first month, or even your first year if you choose the annual plan. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the sponsor today. Let's get on back to WoW. Moving forwards to the Cataclysm, we've got one of the most memorable class stacking moments from Dragon Soul, where a combination of arcane mages and subtlety rogues took on the heroic Spine of Deathwing encounter. So Spine was an absolutely brutal fight when it was current content. The heroic version had a DPS check that was really difficult to beat early on. You need to defeat Burning Tendons during an extremely short DPS window when they were exposed, and if you didn't do this fast enough, you would have to repeat the motions to expose them again and it would extend the fight, often leading to a wipe. And these tendons had so much health that you really had to prioritize specs which could deal the absolute most burst damage possible. And burst damage is what Arcane-Mage and Subtlety Rogues did best. At this point in time, both specs had access to legendary weapons too. Rogues could obtain Fangs of the Father, and Arcane-Mages could get Dragon Wrath. But on top of the legendaries, both specs excelled at short, high burst windows, which is exactly what Spine demanded. Sub-Rogues could use their burst window with Shadow Dance and Vanish to pump out massive damage, and Arcane-Mages would line up Arcane Power and other unused effects. Back in the day, this was one of the biggest events of class stacking we saw for the world first kill of the heroic Spine of Deathwing, where the raid composition brought 5 Subtlety Rogues and 7 Arcane-Mages. That's nearly half the raid's DPS spots on 2 particular specs, just to be able to beat the DPS check. What made this interesting is it wasn't just about these specs being necessarily overpowered at the time, they just had the perfect toolkit to line up with what the fight demanded, and they could both have legendaries, which definitely helped the scenario too. This forced guilds to stack rogues and mages to even have a realistic chance to beat the boss, and indeed back in the day many people considered Spine of Deathwing to be more difficult than the last encounter Madness of Deathwing just because of this DPS check. Now we're heading many expansions into the future, all the way to Battle for Azeroth, and we're going to be seeing rogues being broken again. Spoiler alert, it turns out Rogue is pretty overpowered in this game, but the raid Uldir gave us one of the most blatant examples of class stacking in recent memory with the encounter Mythic Zul. This fight, if you were doing it the intended way, was really difficult to do correctly, as things could just go wrong so easily. But again, Subtlety Rogues were completely busted on this fight. The reason for this was a passive they had called Shuriken Combo. This made it so when they used Fan of Knives, when it hit multiple targets, you'd generate 1 combo point per target hit. And on Zul, you were meant to keep a bunch of ads out of the fight so you could control them, but instead you just keep the ads on top of the boss, and sub-rogues would spam Fan of Knives and then Eviscerate. Your entire rotation for the fight will be Fan of Knives, Eviscerate, and just repeat. Essentially, they were using these ads to pad their single target damage massively. Top guilds went all in on this strategy because it completely trivialized the fight. I even did this fight with a guild back then playing a sub-rogue ult, and I'd completely smash everyone else on the damage meters because it was just so overpowered. Method used 5 sub-rogues in their 20-man mythic raid, and of course Audio was the first race to world first that was done live by Method as well, so people really got a good insight into some of the strategies and creative ways people found of beating bosses. This strategy was so effective because it basically trivialized the second phase of the fight, which was supposed to be the difficult part. Guilds that stacked rogues could just brute force through Zul's DPS check without dealing with all the complicated mechanics that they should have had to. However, Blizzard were not happy about this strategy, and they would go on to nerf sub-rogues significantly. In fact, sub-rogue as an entire spec would suffer for quite a long time because of their performance on Zul. Nevertheless, the damage had been done, and a lot of guilds were able to progress through this raid onto more difficult bosses. But for a moment, rogues were able to show how having this very niche strength could be super effective. Now I want to talk about some class stacking that was actually done during Wrath of the Lich King Classic, specifically in the Naxxramas raid during the Race to World First in that event. And this was when the brand new class proved itself to still be completely busted on a re-release, and here we're talking specifically about Unholy Death Knight. During the Race for the World First Naxxramas 25-man, the World First guild will bring 10 Death Knights to their 25-man composition. This spec could do pretty much everything. It had great single target damage, it had excellent cleave from spreading their diseases about, a permanent ghoul pet thanks to Master of Ghouls, and above all, Summon Gargoyle as your major DPS cooldown that benefited from your current haste value when it was cast. Now, Unholy DKs would optimize their gear for the highest haste values possible. You would have things such as your Meta Gem, your Haste Tinker from Engineering, unused trinkets, Bloodlust, and so on. And when everything lined up and you press Summon Gargoyle, that thing would do unreal amounts of damage. In fact, Summon Gargoyle with haste snapshotting was so overpowered that Blizzard actually went and nerfed it in a later patch. There's something else that people often forget about for Wrath Classic 2, which was a big deal here. When encounters ended or you defeated them, all of your cooldowns were reset. This didn't happen back in the day. It wasn't a thing until Cataclysm, I believe. So you had this class which was entirely dependent on snapshotting every single cooldown in the game, and they had every single cooldown in the game for every boss, making them even more completely busted than they already were. Despite the nerfs though, Death Knight would still be a core part of every single raid comp for World First and Wrath Classic moving forwards, but in Naxxramas in particular, they showed just how truly overpowered they were. And if we're talking about class stacking, we do have to bring up Warriors in vanilla here at some point in time. I would have put this higher on the list, but really everyone knows about stacking Warriors in vanilla, but all the same they deserve a spot just because of how broken they are. A key reason why is in vanilla, rage generation works differently than it does in later expansions. Warriors generated rage based upon the damage they dealt with their auto attacks, and if you dealt more damage, you got more rage, and more rage meant more abilities, which meant more damage. It was a feedback loop that scaled exponentially with gear. This means Warriors are infamously rather weak when they're leveling or without world buffs, but once you start to get pre-biss and some world buffs, you just become the best class in the game by a mile. And in every version of vanilla ever, Warriors will always be the top damage dealer, pretty much because of how the rage mechanic works. But there was more to it than just rage. Warriors had other advantages. Weapon skill in vanilla was an important stat that back in the day went underappreciated for a long time. Humans and orcs had racial bonuses that gave them +5 to their respective weapon types they benefited from. This didn't just increase their hit chance, it also reduced the penalty from glancing blows against boss level enemies. Essentially what this means is they have to itemize for less hit, and their auto attacks deal more damage on average. 5 extra weapon skills sounds small, but it's in fact a absolutely massive advantage, and it's why you'll see the majority of warriors in vanilla always being orc or human. And on WoW Classic Anniversary realms, guilds are breaking records all against stacking warriors. For example, the guild Squawk achieved a Ragnaros kill in just 18 seconds using 23 warriors in their 40-man raid. Other guilds will regularly bring up to 10 warriors easily in their raid comps, and there are many instances of bosses dying in under 10 seconds because of warrior class stacking in Anniversary. And these warriors are even gearing in a unique way as well. The boss kill times are so low that they are able to have 100% uptime on recklessness, meaning they have 100% crit chance. So aside from having hit cap, they don't need to gear for crits because recklessness is doing it. These warriors are getting the fastest kill times in the world using greens that have of strength on them from the auction house. That's the state warriors are at right now. Nevertheless, warriors absolutely deserve a spot on this list as the DPS kings of vanilla and probably one of the most stacked classes ever. Let's head forwards again into Ulduar during Wrath of the Lich King. It was widely considered to be one of the best raids ever made, and the most difficult fight in there was Yogg-Saron Zero Keepers, aka Alone in the Dark. This was, at the time, the hardest boss fight in World of Warcraft's history, but the guild Stars achieved the world first kill, and they did it with a very specific strategy, stacking Affliction Warlocks. Yogg-Saron Zero Lights was a mechanically brutal encounter, and the hardest phase by far was the last one. In this final phase, you were running against the clock as the boss would continually spawn more adds. Eventually these adds would overwhelm your tank and then just run through the raid and absolutely destroy you in a matter of seconds. On top of that, the boss would frequently cast something called Lunatic Gaze. This would give you a debuff if you are facing towards the boss, and if your sanity ever drained to 0, you would become permanently mind controlled for the remainder of the fight. This created a big problem. You needed to do as much damage as possible in this phase, but you also needed to be able to do this damage whilst not facing the boss. The answer was Affliction Warlocks. As a damage over time based spec, Affliction can cast pretty much every single ability in their toolkit without having to face the boss. For damage over time effects such as Corruption or Unstable Affliction, you don't need to face the boss, for example. Abilities you did need to face the boss for were Haunt and the initial cast of Drained Soul, but once Drain started you can turn away and it continues channeling. On top of that, Affliction Warlocks were the best execute spec in the entire game. It was like their kit was tailor-made to be perfect on this fight. Stars, for example, brought 5 Affliction Warlocks to their 25-man raid, and any guild seriously progressing on Yogg-Zero wanted as many Warlocks as they could possibly get. In fact, even in Wrath Classic all those years later, guilds attempting kills week 1 were bringing anywhere from 5 to 7 warlocks for the exact same reasons. The guild stars themselves said in interviews after their kill that affliction warlocks were the most valuable class for this encounter. They also noted the fight was more focused on execution and player skill than anything else, but having that right class composition with multiple warlocks was still crucial to their success. In fact, they themselves said this fight was harder than anything in the Sunwell, and I've done both of them too, and I'm rather inclined to agree. Now let's jump forwards a few expansions. Tomb of Sargeras in Legion featured one of the longest and most grueling race to world firsts in modern WoW history. Method would ultimately claim world first on Mythic Kil'jaeden after hundreds and hundreds of wipes on the last 2 bosses combined. What made their composition interesting was the number of rogues that they brought, and you know, for the first time ever, it's not primarily always about the damage. This raid was nicknamed by the community Tomb of Sargeras, soaking just being an ability the boss does that you have to send multiple people to stand in, and here rogues excelled time and again. For Fallen Avatar, the penultimate boss, Method brought 5 rogues to their 25-man mythic raid. But why rogues here again? Well, as mentioned, the answer is both damage and survivability. Here for rogues, they would first of all have Cloak of Shadows, an ability that would make them immune to magic damage for its duration. And using Cloak, rogues could quite easily just stand in stuff that other classes would straight up need immunities to live through, or at least external cooldowns. On Kil'jaeden, rogues continued to be valuable for similar reasons, most importantly with again Cloak of Shadows and Feint. Now Feint is really what deserves a special mention here, because honestly it had been in a crazy overpowered state for literally years at this point in time. It would reduce area of effect damage by a huge amount and could be used constantly, meaning rogues were just standing in stuff which would have outright killed other classes no problem. This wasn't just a thing specific to Legion. Rogues have been trivializing mechanics with Feint for literally expansions in a row. Blizzard just never got around to changing it because I guess this was just an area where rogues were expected to excel. Method raid leader Scripe said in interviews after their kill that rogues were simply too strong in Tomb of Sargeras. He joked that they considered gearing up 5 rogues initially but thought that 4 must be enough, and when you combine their survivability with their good overall damage, rogues were the complete package for a raid tier where survivability on Mythic was just as important as damage. What makes this example different from other ones is that it wasn't about finding a broken damage interaction. It was about recognizing a class's defensive toolkit was so good that it could deal with mechanics that other classes just couldn't. Method used rogues to turn what should have been a raid wiping ability into something that 1 or 2 players could handle. Blizzard would go on in later expansions to modify rogues' survivability, and I think these last 2 bosses in Fallen Avatar and Mythic Kil'jaeden were a big reason why. Next we're going back to one of the most infamous examples of class stacking in WoW's history, and it comes from the very beginning of the Cataclysm expansion. In early 2011, the Finnish guild Paragon achieved the world first kill of heroic Nefarian in Blackwing Descent, and when they posted their kill screenshots and videos, people noticed something a little bit strange. They had 11 druids in the raid, 11 out of their 25 members that was. The reason for this extreme class stacking came down to a specific mechanic and how it interacted with feral druid bleeds on Nefarian. Throughout the Nefarian encounter on Heroic, players would be randomly mind-controlled by an ability called Dominion. Whilst you were mind-controlled, you would gradually walk towards a portal, and here you had 2 choices. You could break the mind control and be free and go in DPS, or you could spam an ability of Siphon Power to build stacks of a buff called Stolen Power. Stolen Power increased your damage and healing by 3% per stack, up to a maximum of 150 stacks. That's a potential of 450% extra damage. For most classes, this buff will be consumed in a few abilities, so you get a few massive hits and then the buff will be gone. But for feral druids, they had a different experience. This was because a lot of their abilities came through their bleed damage over time effects, and when you cast Rip with Stolen Power when the boss was below 25% health, you could then Ferocious Bite and benefit from a talent that would automatically refresh the duration duration of your rip, essentially making it so you could carry this absolutely insane dot for the remainder of the fight. But even beyond that, if a feral druid just got mind controlled at any point in time, they'd be able to contribute an enormous amount of damage on the boss. Paragon brought 11 druids to their kill, with the majority of them being feral DPS. This wasn't technically a bug or an exploit either. Stolen Power was working how it was expected to work, and so were feral druids. Blizzard just hadn't anticipated that a damage over time effect would benefit so dramatically from this buff. There was a bit of back and forth after Paragon's kill about them class stacking like this, but at the end of the day, they're a guild going for the race to world first. If you want to be the best, sometimes you have to come up with unique strategies, and sometimes those unique strategies involve filling your raid with cats. Paragon themselves defended the strategy, noting that 11 druids were possible because at the end of the day, druids could still fill every single role in the raid. It's not like they were running 11 feral druids for the entire tier, it was just for this one encounter. Nevertheless though, this is one of the more memorable instances of class stacking during a race to world first. At number 2, we go to the Crucible of Storms in Battle for Azeroth. This was a short 2-boss raid that ended up being way more difficult than anyone expected. The European Guild Pieces claimed the world first kill by downing Mythic Unat, and their raid composition was absolutely crazy, using 14 ranged DPS, 5 of those being Elemental Shaman, 4 of them Warlocks, and only 1 melee DPS, which was a Demon Hunter who, at least back then, put up a debuff that made enemies take more magic damage. The fight heavily rewarded being able to attack from range where you have more space to deal with mechanics. Elemental Shaman specifically here brought incredible value beyond their damage. They had Reincarnation, giving the raid an extra battle resurrection to recover from mistakes, or indeed deliberately have Shamans die to certain mechanics so they didn't have to be dealt with, and then just have them reincarnate and carry on. Warlocks provided their own unique advantages too, such as Demonic Gateway to help out the raid reposition, and they had strong sustained damage, execute, and AoE damage too. Pieces took over 700 pulls to kill Unat in total. That is the single largest pull count of any M boss in World of Warcraft's history, and it absolutely goes down as one of the most difficult fights ever. In interviews after their kill, Pieces explained their choice to stack Elemental Shamans over bringing more Warlocks. They noted whilst Warlock's mobility was good, being able to teleport around the encounter, the damage they were taking was fairly healable, whereas Shaman brought extra reincarnations that was key to their strategy. What makes this example notable is how extreme the class restriction was. It's one thing to say you want to bring more range than melee, or to bring a few of one more so than the other. It's another thing to entirely bring a singular melee who is there just for a debuff. If Demon Hunters didn't have that magic debuff, I'm sure they wouldn't have been there, and Pieces would have brought along more Warlock or Shaman. But for Mythic Unat, this is what the fight demanded, and Pieces had the raid comp to make it work. For the number 1 spot, we're going to Warlords of Draenor's final patch and the Hellfire Citadel raid. Whilst this wasn't race to world first or even a particularly difficult boss, this was perhaps the best example of ridiculous class stacking this game has ever seen. The second boss became a bit of a meme for one thing, and that was Arcane Mages absolutely destroying it in a matter of seconds. The setup for this required several different things to come together. First was a new talent in Warlords called Prismatic Crystal. You place a crystal down on the ground, and it would replicate a bonus 30% of your damage dealt to it to nearby targets. This was already overpowered, but it gets better. Second was a trinket from Hellfire Citadel called Prophecy of Fear. This trinket made your direct damaging abilities trigger an additional burst of AoE damage. Most classes could proc this every few seconds. Arcane Mages, however, could proc it constantly thanks to arcane missiles. On top of that, there was something else in Warlords of Draenor called Multi-Strike. This gave your attacks a chance to hit 2 additional times at 30% of their original damage. When you combined all of these factors with fully geared Arcane Mages popping their cooldowns, the result was absolutely crazy. And guilds would realize that you could just stack Arcane Mages and absolutely blow up bosses in Hellfire Citadel, and this is when this was still current content. On Mythic mode, by the way, there was a group that ran 17 Arcane Mages. That's 17 out of your 20 raid spots, and if you look at Warcraft logs data from Hellfire Citadel Mythic, particularly on Iron Reaver, Arcane Mages were absolutely crushing every single other spec in the game. The gap between them and second place looked like vanilla levels of warrior dominance. Then again, this was right at the end of the expansion, and this strategy didn't exactly work on every single boss either. And shortly after, the pre-patch for Legion would come around and things would all be shaken up significantly. But for a moment here, Arcane Mages were able to do something truly ridiculous. Class Class stacking, when you think back to it, really has been a part of World of Warcraft for as long as the game has existed. Sometimes it's subtle, bringing an extra shaman for more bloodlust. Sometimes it's a bit more extreme, like when you're running 11 feral druids, 14 ranged DPS, or maybe even 23 warriors. But often it's guilds pushing the absolute limits, racing for world first, going for speed clears, and so on. These moments show both the brilliance and sometimes the flaws of WoW's class design. On one hand, it's amazing to see players discover interactions and strategies that the developers never foresaw. On the other, it can feel bad when your class is not the meta pick and you're watching somebody else who's just rolled an ult to do double your damage. And class stacking is something that Blizzard constantly has to deal with each new raid tier as well, because inevitably there's often just one class or spec which is just amazing at dealing with certain scenarios. But that's about all I've got for you today. Were there any other examples of class stacking you remember that didn't make the list here? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks again to boot.dev for supporting the channel. Their courses are free to view, so if you're interested, why not check them out via the links down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.